There are photographs that tell you everything on the surface. A family gathered in their Sunday best. A parlor arranged for the occasion. A photographer's instruction to hold still. The specific frozen quality of Victorian portraiture. The rigid postures. The unsmiling faces. The long exposure times that demanded absolute stillness and produced, as a byproduct, an atmosphere of gravity that we now read as solemnity but was simply the practical requirement of the technology. Most Victorian family photographs are exactly what they appear to be. Documents of a moment, records of faces, evidence that specific people existed at a specific time and wanted that existence recorded. And then there are the photographs that are not what they appear to be. Not because they were staged in any fraudulent sense. Not because the people in them were pretending to be something they were not, but because the camera, in its mechanical indifference to what the eye wants to see and what the eye chooses not to see, recorded something that the people present either did not notice, or noticed and did not fully understand, or understood completely and hoped no one else ever would. The photograph we are discussing tonight was taken in the autumn of 1882 in a prosperous household in upstate New York. It shows a family of 7 arranged in the formal manner of the period, the patriarch seated at the center, his wife beside him, their 5 children arranged around them in the careful hierarchy of Victorian family portraiture. The photographer was a professional. The setting was a well-appointed parlor. The occasion was, by the inscription on the reverse of the original print, the patriarch's 50th birthday. It is, on first examination, an entirely ordinary photograph of an entirely ordinary prosperous American family at the apex of the Gilded Age. It is on second examination, on the careful, zoomed examination, that the photograph's digital archiving in the 1990s made possible for the first time something considerably more than that. We will get to what the experts found. But to understand why what they found matters, you first need to understand who these people were. Because the photograph did not appear out of nowhere. It has a family attached to it. And the family has a history. And the history is the context without which the photograph is merely strange rather than genuinely disturbing. The family in the photograph were the Ashworths of Saratoga County, New York. Edward Ashworth, the patriarch turning 50 in 1882, was a manufacturer of agricultural equipment who had built a moderately successful business in the decade following the Civil War. His wife Margaret was 44. Their children ranged in age from 8 to 22. The eldest, a son named Thomas, had recently returned from 2 years working in the family's Chicago distribution office. The second child, a daughter named Eleanor, was 19. The 3 younger children, Henry, James, and Clara, were 17, 13, and 8 respectively. By every available public record, the Ashworths were unremarkable. Their name appears in the county business directory, in church records, in the local newspaper's social columns. Edward Ashworth was on the board of a local bank. Margaret Ashworth organized charitable bazaars. Thomas was engaged to be married. Eleanor was described in a society column as one of the most accomplished young ladies of the county. The family occupied the specific social position of prosperous provincial respectability. Not wealthy enough to be truly notable, not struggling enough to attract concern, existing comfortably in the middle of a documented society. And then there's the photograph. The photograph was donated to the Saratoga County Historical Society in 1947 by a descendant of the family who found it among the effects of a recently deceased relative and thought, as people sometimes do when clearing the belongings of the dead, that it might be of historical interest. It sat in the Society's archive for decades, catalogued and largely unexamined, one of thousands of Victorian family photographs that document the visual record of a prosperous 19th-century American county. In 1994, as part of a broader archiving project, the photograph was digitized. The process was routine. The result was not. The first person to examine the digitized image with any attention was an archivist named Dr. Patricia Ellsworth, who was working through the Society's photographic collection as part of a doctoral research on Gilded Age domestic portraiture. She was looking at the image on a computer screen, something that had not been possible when the photograph was simply a physical print in a box, and she had, as was her professional habit, zoomed in on the faces. She found what she described in her research notes as an anomaly in the background. Not in the faces. Not in the formal arrangement of the family. In the background. Behind the family. Visible between the edge of Thomas Ashworth's shoulder and the curtained window to the right of the frame, there was a doorway, a partially open door leading to what appeared to be an adjoining room. The door was open perhaps 6 inches wide enough to show a slice of the room beyond. In that slice of room, visible in the background of a formal family portrait taken on the occasion of a patriarch's 50th birthday, there was a figure that was not part of the family group, a figure that was not the photographer, whose position in front of the camera was fixed and whose presence would have been visible differently in the frame, a figure that appeared, in Dr. Ellsworth's initial description, to be standing completely still in the adjoining room, facing the doorway, watching the photograph being taken. She noted it in her research file and moved on. At the time, the most obvious interpretation was the most boring one, a household servant, waiting to re-enter the room after the photograph was complete. Victorian households employed staff. Staff moved through the rooms of those houses. A servant glimpsed through a partially opened door in the background of a family photograph was not, on its own, a significant discovery. But Dr. Ellsworth, who was a careful researcher, had noted something in the initial zoom that she returned to several weeks later when she was reviewing her notes. The figure in the doorway was not standing in the posture of a servant waiting to re-enter a room. It was not standing sideways or partially turned away in the manner of someone who had paused their movement at an inconvenient moment. It was facing the camera directly. Its posture was deliberate, and its face, which the zoom had made partially visible through the gap in the doorway, appeared to be, and this was the detail that Dr. Ellsworth had noted with a question mark and returned to smiling. Not the careful, composed expression of a Victorian household member who had wandered into the background of a photograph. Something that read, to a trained observer of Victorian portraiture, as an expression of specific and directed awareness, as though whoever was standing in that doorway knew exactly what was being recorded and wanted to be seen in it. She brought the photograph to the attention of her supervisor. Her supervisor brought it to the attention of a colleague who specialized in photographic forensics. The forensic examination of the image took 3 months. What it produced was a finding that none of the 3 academics involved had anticipated when the process began. The forensic examination of the 1882 Ashworth photograph was conducted by Dr. James Harrington of Cornell University's Photographic Sciences Department, working from the digitized image and, later, from the original physical print which the Historical Society made available for direct examination under controlled conditions. Dr. Harrington's initial task was to determine whether the figure in the doorway was a photographic artifact, a double exposure, a processing defect, a shadow or light reflection that had created a human-shaped anomaly, or whether it was a genuine image of a person present at the scene. His finding on this initial question was unambiguous. The figure in the doorway was a real person who was physically present in the room at the time the photograph was taken. The grain structure of the image in the area of the figure was consistent with the grain throughout the rest of the photograph. The figure's relationship to the available light sources was physically coherent. It cast a small shadow at its feet consistent with the direction of the light in the main room. It was not a processing artifact. It was not a double exposure. It was a person. The second question was the more difficult one. Who was the person? The figure in the doorway was partially obscured by the doorframe and the limited opening of the door. What was visible was the figure's face from approximately the nose upward, both shoulders, and the upper portion of the torso. The clothing visible was consistent with the period of a dark jacket or coat of the type worn by men in the 1880s. The figure was male. The figure was, based on its height relative to the doorframe, of average or slightly above average height for the period. The face, partially visible, was turned directly toward the camera. The expression, and here the forensic analysis became more subjective, more dependent on interpretation. The expression was described by Dr. Harrington in his formal report as alight and directed, consistent with intentional awareness of the photographic process rather than accidental presence. The question of whether the figure was smiling, which Dr. Ellsworth had noted in her initial observation, was addressed in the forensic report with careful qualification. Dr. Harrington wrote that the visible portion of the figure's lower face showed an asymmetry of expression that could be interpreted as a partial smile, but that the resolution of the original photographic material and the partial obscuration by the doorframe made this interpretation uncertain. He was unwilling to conclude definitively that the figure was smiling. He was equally unwilling to conclude that it was not. The third and most significant question was one that none of the researchers had initially anticipated asking, but that the forensic examination eventually made unavoidable. Was the figure in the doorway a member of the Ashworth household? To answer this question, Dr. Harrington and his colleagues cross-referenced the visible characteristics of the figure with every available image of the adult male members of the Ashworth family, principally Thomas Ashworth, who was the only adult son, and Edward Ashworth himself, who was seated in the main group and therefore definitively not the figure in the doorway. Thomas's position in the main group was also confirmed. He was present in the formal portrait arrangement, standing behind and to the left of his father's chair. He could not simultaneously be the figure in the doorway. There was no other adult male member of the immediate Ashworth family. Edward's brother had died in 1879. There were no male cousins or other relatives documented as resident in the household in 1882. The household staff, as recorded in the 1880 census 2 years before the photograph, consisted of a cook, a housemaid, and a gardener, all female except the gardener, who was described in the census as 63 years old and who, based on the figure's apparent height and build, could not be the person in the doorway. So who was standing in the doorway of the Ashworth parlor watching a family portrait being taken on an October afternoon in 1882? The answer that the forensic examination was unable to provide sent the case to a second group of specialists, historians and genealogists who spent the following 2 years working through every available Ashworth family document, letters, diaries, business records, legal papers, church records, newspaper mentions, looking for any reference to an unidentified male associated with the household in 1882. What they found was not the answer to the question. What they found was something that made the question considerably more interesting. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. In the summer of 1882, 4 months before the birthday photograph was taken, the Ashworth family's eldest son Thomas had returned from his 2 years in Chicago. His return had been expected for some time. His father's letters to the Chicago office manager from the spring of 1882 referenced Thomas's planned departure and expressed satisfaction at the prospect of his son's return. Thomas arrived home in June 1882 and, by every account that survives, resumed his place in the family household without incident. But among the Ashworth family papers archived at the Historical Society, alongside the more routine correspondence, there was a letter, a single letter, written in a hand that the genealogists could not immediately identify, addressed to Thomas Ashworth at the family home, dated September 14, 1882, 6 weeks before the birthday photograph was taken. The letter was unsigned. Its content, which the researchers transcribed in full, was brief. It said, in its entirety, "I know what you brought back from Chicago. I know you believe it is contained. It is not contained. I will be at the house on the 23rd. You will want to be there." The 23rd of October, 1882 was Edward Ashworth's 50th birthday, the day the photograph was taken. The letter changed the nature of the investigation. Until its discovery, the figure in the doorway had been an unexplained anomaly in a historical photograph. Curious, technically verified as real, but without context that would make it something more than a face behind a door. The letter gave it context. It suggested that someone had deliberately positioned themselves to be present at the Ashworth house on the specific day of the photograph. Someone who had business with Thomas Ashworth. Someone who knew something about Thomas Ashworth that Thomas apparently wanted kept from public knowledge. Something Thomas had brought back from Chicago. The researchers working on the Ashworth case, by this point a small informal group of historians, archivists, and one forensic document examiner, none of whom were working within any institutional framework but who had become collectively absorbed by the case, began their investigation of Thomas Ashworth's time in Chicago with the focus and the specific urgency that the letter had generated. What they found in the Chicago records was fragmentary in the way that the records of private individuals from the 1880s are almost always fragmentary. Thomas Ashworth had worked in the Chicago office of his father's agricultural equipment business from 1880 to 1882. He had lived in a boarding house on the north side of the city. He had, in 1881, been involved in some form of legal proceeding, the nature of which was not entirely clear from the available documents, but which appeared to involve a civil rather than criminal matter, and which had been resolved, as far as the researchers could determine, before Thomas left Chicago. The boarding house records for 1880 and 1881 listed Thomas Ashworth as a resident. They also listed, as a resident for a period of approximately 7 months in 1881, A man named David Crane. David Crane. The name meant nothing initially. It was not a name that appeared in any Ashworth family document. It was not a name that appeared in the Saratoga County records. It was the name of a man who had lived in the same boarding house as Thomas Ashworth in Chicago for 7 months in 1881 and then, as far as the available records were concerned, ceased to exist. The forensic document examiner in the group, a woman named Sarah Chen who had spent 20 years analyzing historical handwriting for insurance and estate cases, examined the unsigned letter against samples of handwriting from every person associated with the Ashworth case for whom samples existed. She found no match within the known circle. She then ran the handwriting against a database of 19th-century American handwriting samples maintained by a university archive. She found a partial match, not definitive partial, in a document from the Chicago court records of 1881, a deposition filed in a civil case. The deposition was filed by a man named David Crane. The civil case from Chicago 1881, when the researchers finally located its full record in the Cook County archives, was a property dispute. On its surface, it was entirely mundane, a disagreement about the ownership of certain goods and documents that had been held in a shared storage arrangement. The two parties to the dispute were David Crane and Thomas Ashworth. The case had been settled out of court in the autumn of 1881, with the terms of the settlement sealed by the presiding judge at the request of both parties. Sealed settlements in 1881 were not unusual, but the judge's notation on the sealing order, a brief handwritten comment that had survived in the court's records despite the sealing of the underlying documents, read as follows: "Settlement agreed on condition of mutual silence regarding matters of personal character." Both parties are bound by terms. Matters of personal character. In the Victorian lexicon of legal language, this phrase had a specific and understood meaning. It referred to information that, if made public, would damage the social standing and reputation of one or both of the parties involved. It was the language of secrets, of things that prosperous families and their sons did not want the world to know. Thomas Ashworth had a sealed settlement with David Crane from 1881, binding both parties to silence on matters of personal character. Thomas had returned to Saratoga County in June 1882. 6 weeks before his father's 50th birthday, he had received a letter from someone who knew about whatever he had brought back from Chicago and who stated that it was not contained. And on the day of the birthday photograph, someone was standing in the doorway of the Ashworth parlor watching the family portrait being taken. The photograph, the letter, the sealed settlement, the missing man named David Crane. The researchers had, by this point, spent the better part of 3 years with the Ashworth case. They had found a great deal. They had answered very little. The figure in the doorway had a possible name, David Crane, but the identification could not be confirmed because no image of David Crane had been found against which to compare the partially visible face in the photograph. The letter writer could not be definitively identified. The contents of the sealed settlement remained sealed. What the case had produced was not a solution but a structure, a set of documented connections between documented facts that pointed towards something that Thomas Ashworth had been involved in during his time in Chicago, something that David Crane knew about, something that Crane had apparently decided, in the autumn of 1882, was not as contained as Thomas believed, something that had brought a man to stand in a doorway and watch a family photograph being taken with an expression that one expert described as alert and directed and another described as a partial smile. The case did not end with the researchers. It did not end with the sealed court records or the unsigned letter or the boarding house documents. It ended, in the sense that any cold historical case ends, with a question that the available evidence generates but cannot answer. But before we get to that question, the question that has made the 1882 Ashworth photograph one of the most discussed examples of anomalous historical photography among the specific community of people who discuss such things, there is one more piece of evidence that the investigation produced. A piece that arrived not from archives or court records or genealogical databases, but from a source that none of the researchers had thought to consult. The photograph itself. Not the figure in the doorway. The family in the foreground. The formally posed group that everyone who looked at the photograph had been looking past in their focus on the anomaly in the background. Dr. Patricia Ellsworth, who had been the first person to notice the figure in the doorway and who had continued to work with the photograph throughout the years of investigation, returned to the image in 2001 with a specific question she had not previously asked. She had been focusing on the background. What was happening in the foreground? She was looking, with the benefit of years of studying Victorian portraiture, at the faces of the family group. Edward Ashworth, the patriarch at the center, was looking at the camera in the directed way of all Victorian portrait subjects. His expression was the composed neutrality of a man sitting for a formal photograph. Nothing in his face suggested awareness of anything unusual. Margaret Ashworth, seated beside her husband, was similarly composed. Her eyes were on the camera. Her expression was the formal stillness of the occasion. The three younger children, Henry, James, and Clara, showed the various degrees of concentrated stillness that Victorian portrait photography demanded of children who had been told to hold still and look at the camera. Eleanor Ashworth, the 19-year-old daughter, was looking at the camera, but her hands, which rested in her lap and which the foreground lighting of the portrait made clearly visible, were tightly clasped. Not the relaxed arrangement of a woman sitting comfortably for a formal photograph. The specific tight clasp of someone whose hands are doing something that the rest of their body is trying to conceal from the camera. And Thomas Ashworth, Thomas, who had received the letter. Thomas, who had the sealed settlement. Thomas, who had brought something back from Chicago that was apparently not contained. Thomas was looking at the camera. But his eyes, in the high-resolution zoom that the digital archive made possible, were not focused on the lens. They were focused slightly to the right of the lens, at a specific angle that, when Dr. Ellsworth calculated the geometry of the room as recorded in the photograph, pointed precisely toward the partially open doorway in the background. Thomas Ashworth knew the figure was there. He was looking at it while sitting for his father's birthday portrait, while holding the composed expression of a Victorian gentleman at a formal family occasion, with his hands folded and his posture correct and his face showing nothing. He knew. This is Grimveil Epoch, where forgotten stories resurface. Subscribe, and like the video, don't miss what rises next from the darkness. The discovery that Thomas's gaze was directed at the doorway rather than the camera transformed the case in a way that none of the previous discoveries had. All of the previous evidence had been circumstantial in the technical sense. It pointed toward a connection between Thomas and the figure in the doorway without establishing what that connection meant or why it mattered. The sealed settlement and the unsigned letter and the boarding house records all pointed at something without naming it. Thomas's gaze named the relationship between the man in the photograph and the man in the doorway as one of mutual awareness. Whatever was between them, it was not the unaware presence of a servant glimpsed accidentally. The man in the doorway knew he was being observed by the camera. The man in the family portrait knew the man in the doorway was there. They were, in some way that the photograph documents without explaining, connected, in communication, engaged in something that was happening not despite the birthday portrait being taken but in the presence of it. The question of what that something was has never been answered. The sealed court records from Chicago have been the subject of an access request by the researchers, denied on the grounds that the sealing order had no expiration and remains legally in effect under Illinois state law. The Ashworth family, such that it survived into the 21st century, had no knowledge of the events of 1882 that the investigation had uncovered. The descendants who donated the photograph to the Historical Society in 1947 did so without any apparent awareness that it contained anything unusual. David Crane, if the figure in the doorway was David Crane, disappeared from the historical record after the letter of September 1882. He is not in the 1890 census. He is not in any Chicago record after the sealed settlement. He is not in any Saratoga County record at any point. He left one letter, one deposition in a sealed file, 7 months in a boarding house register, and a face partially visible in a doorway in a photograph taken on the 23rd of October, 1882. And Thomas Ashworth, who knew he was there, who looked at him while sitting for a birthday portrait, who received a letter telling him that whatever he had tried to contain from his Chicago years was not contained. Thomas Ashworth's subsequent history is documented and entirely ordinary. He married his fiancée in 1883. He took over the family business on his father's death in 1891. He died in 1924 at the age of 64. His obituary in the local paper described him as a respected businessman and community figure. Nothing in the public record of Thomas Ashworth's life suggests that the events of October 1882 had any lasting consequences. Whatever David Crane had come to say, whatever he had brought to the house on the 23rd, whatever he had meant when he said that it was not contained, it appears, from the subsequent trajectory of Thomas Ashworth's thoroughly documented ordinary life, to have been contained after all. Or perhaps it was simply never discovered. The 1882 Ashworth photograph now sits in the digital archive of the Saratoga County Historical Society, available for public viewing on the Society's online database. The original physical print is in a climate-controlled storage facility. It is catalogued under a reference number. Its description in the archive database reads, Family Portrait, Ashworth Family, October 1882. Provenance donated 1947. The anomaly in the background is not mentioned in the catalog description. The investigation that the anomaly generated is not documented in the Society's official records. The letter and the sealed court case and the boarding house registers and the geometry of Thomas Ashworth's gaze exist in the research notes of the academics and historians who spent years working on the case, in a body of informal scholarship that has never been formally published. The photograph sits in the database, and anyone who downloads it and zooms in on the background can see what Dr. Ellsworth saw in 1994 when the digitization first made it visible. A doorway, a figure, a face partially visible through a 6-inch gap, an expression that may or may not be a partial smile. What the viewer brings to that image determines what they see in it. A viewer who knows nothing of the history sees a servant glimpsed accidentally. A viewer who has followed the investigation sees a man named David Crane who wrote a letter and came to a house on a specific day and stood in a doorway and looked at a camera while the man in the foreground looked back at him. What was between them? The photograph documents without explaining. What Thomas brought back from Chicago? The sealed court records contain without revealing. What David Crane knew that Thomas believed was contained but was not, that knowledge went wherever Crane went after September 1882. Into the undocumented gaps of the historical record where the people who chose not to leave a trace have always lived. The photograph is 142 years old. The figure in the doorway has been visible in it for all 142 years, hidden in plain sight in the background of an entirely ordinary family portrait, waiting for someone to zoom in. The face is clear enough, in the high-resolution digital archive, to see that it is turned directly toward the camera. Clear enough to see that the expression is not the expression of someone who wandered accidentally into a photograph and did not realize it. Clear enough to see that whoever was standing in that doorway wanted to be there. I wanted to be seen. Perhaps wanted, in some specific and deliberate way, to be found. 142 years later, the finding is incomplete. The story is assembled from fragments and pointed at a conclusion that the evidence approaches but does not reach. Thomas Ashworth is in the foreground looking sideways. David Crane, or whoever was in that doorway, is in the background looking directly at you. The photograph contains both of them. It has always contained both of them. It will continue to contain both of them for as long as the archive holds. Some photographs tell you everything on the surface, and some photographs wait for someone with the right tools and the right questions and enough patience to stay with an image until it gives up what it has been holding. The 1882 Ashworth photograph has given up quite a lot. It has not given up everything. New dark history every week on Grimveil Epoch. Subscribe so you never miss the next story that the official record tried to leave behind. The buried do not always stay buried. And some faces, once seen, are impossible to stop seeing.